Who invented the first B double or B train? You might be familiar with this configuration of double trailers. For some of us, we see it all the time on the road. Two semi-trailers connected together by this coupling method, which is fixed as part of the lead trailer. This is called a B double in Australia or a B train in Canada. Well, one day I wondered to myself, when did these start driving on the road? What does the B stand for and what is the history? Hi, I'm Cameron, and in this video we will cover the history of this trailer configuration. This video is set out in chronological order by the events that happened during the dates. It also seems to fit in quite nicely with a breakup by country. Canada and Australia seem to be the biggest players in the world when it comes to the use of this configuration, and so this video mainly centers around these two countries, but we briefly touch on some other uses in other countries too. Please note, I consider this video as a draft and one issued on the internet for peer review purposes, so please comment on any errors and most importantly, help me out on missing information I haven't been able to find. You'll be able to see what I need research help with at the end of this video. Firstly, let's get some different terminology out of the way, as Australia and Canada use different names for the same thing. In Australia, we call this the B double. In Canada, they call it the B train. In Australia, we call this coupling system the turntable, and in Canada, the fifth wheel. Okay. B double and B train are the same thing. Turntable and fifth wheel are the same thing. Excellent. Now we have this out of the way, we can move forward. I'll mainly call it a B double in the video, but it's the same as a B train. Like so many truckers out there, the general belief is that the B double story started and originated in Canada. Sorry, this is not the case. However, the Canadians did pioneer the modern B double design and were the first country to use them on a large scale, so they definitely deserve most of the credit for their efforts. The name B train originates in Canada. The Australian name B double was later modified from the existing Canadian name not long after its introduction into Australia for reasons we'll get into later. The Canadian name B train seems to originate in the early 1970s, apparently after the investigation and study into the two coupling types between trailers, which were designated A coupling for a drawbar connection and B coupling for a fifth wheel or turntable connection. Early 1940s, our story begins. Okay, so what was the first B double? My research took me back to the early 1940s in America during World War II. This is believed by most people to be the oldest documented setup of what is now known as the B double or B train. Only two photos seem to exist that I've been able to find. This particular B double was operated by Grondike Transport, from where I believe the photos were originally provided. Grondike Transport are still around today and are based in Oklahoma, USA. Grondike Transport had a contract with the government during World War II to haul fuel for the US Army Air Force to aviation airfields not serviced by rail. It is assumed that this truck only operated within the USA, but I'm not really sure. In the photos, the trailers are being pulled by a federal branded truck, and the trailers are said to have been manufactured by Butler Manufacturing. The design is very similar to Type F-1A Army fuel tanker. Perhaps it was originally this, but with modifications made. The numbers on the side of each tanker trailers are USAW-010630 on the lead trailer and USAW-010630 on the rear trailer. If this means anything to anybody who can link it to more information, please let me know. We see the same design of tanker trailers used during the war, except these are in the A double or A configuration. I found plenty of these photos, but they were not B doubles. We can also see this truck is shown in a book called Truck by Trailer by John Conley for the Truck Trailer Manufacturers Association in America. I recommend the book. It's great. 1947. Next, we move into 1947, and the Keeney double, as he called his invention back then, was manufactured in California, USA. I found out about this B double after first reading about it in a now defunct website called Hank's Truck Pictures, which included a discussion forum and truck articles. Some of the articles published on this website were written by the late Martin Phippard from the UK. Martin Phippard was a well-known name in the trucking community as a researcher of the trucking history and as a publisher. After originally being a writer in trucking magazines, he researched, wrote and co-wrote a trucking book, as well as the creation of several DVD documentaries on trucks. I had heard that Martin Phippard had information about the history of the B doubles on the now defunct Hank's Truck Pictures website, but it had already been taken down. I was lucky enough to get a copy of the articles that were on the website about the B doubles. It was Martin Phippard's opinion that the first B double was made by Dan Keeney from USA in California. Perhaps Martin didn't know about the World War II truck back then. I'm not sure. Dan Keeney had his own truck business in California, Keeney Truck Lines. By 1947, Dan had gone on to design and build a B double by installing a turntable, or fifth wheel, onto the back of the lead semi-trailer. The lead trailer was about 20 feet long and the rear trailer about 30 feet long. The two trailers were pulled by a gas-powered International K-11 single-screw prime mover, or tractor. Today, the Keeney family are still around and operating trucks. In one of Martin Phippard's documentaries, B-Train Bonanza 1, which I bought a copy of, Martin had interviewed Dan's son, who told the story. I recommend Martin Phippard's DVD collection. In the beginning of the DVD, it talks of Dan Keeney's B-Train in California in the 1940s.
Hello, my name is Martin Phippard and I'd like to tell you a little about the history and development of a twin trailer combination commonly referred to as a B-train.
And my name is Walt Keeney. I'm president of the Food Express. 1987 Food Express. My father, who was in business of hauling brick and clay products, wanted to set up doubles so he could maximize load space and have something very...
1953. By 1953, 6 similar B-trains were used, these having been built by the now defunct Foster Trailer Company in Los Angeles. I have no photos or further information on this. 1950s. I have another lead with no further information. In the early 1950s, English manufacturer Foden supposedly conceived the idea and built a B-double, but soon dropped the idea as its 32-ton maximum allowance could be achieved with a normal single articulated truck, i.e. just a normal semi-trailer. Now moving to the 40s, 50s and 60s as a general. It should be known that we should give credit to those people who built one-off B-doubles before they started to become popular in the 1970s. I found multiple sources claiming that such and such made a B-double back in the day and were the first. I have no doubt that some individuals around the world independently from one another made one-off B-doubles in the 40s, 50s or 60s, perhaps even earlier. Here we see a picture from Australia of what looks like a jerry-rigged up B-train. No date, but assumed old. I found someone online in South Australia who said their father made a B-double in 1961 and luckily had some photos to back it up. Thanks, Liz. In the 1970s, the Canadian trucking monthly magazine called Motor Truck ran a questionnaire to their readers asking manufacturers and operators who ran the first B-double. Several responders assumed they were the first to build and operate one. One response from Arrow Transfer in British Columbia stated they first employed the concept in 1967. Additionally, tank truck transport, most likely from Sudbury, Ontario, claimed to operate a double tanker B train built by Fruhoff Canada, transporting acid for the International Nickel Company in the mid-1950s, but no photos were provided. Very few B doubles seem to have been employed in Canada and in America in the 50s and 60s, and were no doubt just isolated developments by innovative truckers. I don't doubt some of these claims, and I'm sure there were multiple people years ago from around the world who each, independently from each other, invented the B double, but unfortunately little to nothing is documented. I wanted to point this out as these people still deserve credit and to be part of the documented history. I don't think we will ever really know who was the first, but most likely it was the tanker trailers made for Klondike transport in World War II. Now we move into the early 1970s and we enter the Canada scene. So buckle up. This is when and where the development and surge of the B double begins. Before the B doubles, there were already A trains in Canada, known as A doubles in Australia. They were already common and in use at the time. In Canada, before they were called A trains, they were dubbed wiggle wagons, and for good reason too. The B double configuration provided a viable alternative as a safer choice, as they didn't wiggle all over the place as much as the A train or A double. There is so little data on the early days of the B doubles in Canada. The start of the B double development and production in Canada first began as logging trucks, sometimes called jinker trailers, for the Canadian forest industry, which transported logs for timber, paper, and pulp products before moving on to liquid tanker trailers a few years later in the mid-1970s for hauling liquid fuels and other liquids. 1971. The earliest of documented data begins in the early 1970s in Canada. I visited the State Library of New South Wales and flicked through many old Canadian pulp and paper magazines issued in the 1970s trying to find something. I finally found something that resembled a B double in one of the magazines dated 1971. It was an article about forestry products showcased at the annual Forest Industries Equipment Exhibition in 1971. The name B train was not used, but it certainly does look like the same configuration in the picture. However, when I read the description, it mentions the use of a dolly, which is not consistent with a B double or B train. A dolly is used in an A train or A double. I wonder if they were incorrectly calling the lead trailer a dolly. I don't really know. I couldn't find out much on the company. I believe they were based in a town called Woodstock in Ontario, Canada. I was not able to find more information or a picture of the so-called Royal line mentioned in the magazine, or the trailer setup mentioned. 1974. The absolute earliest mention I could find which mentioned the phrase B train was in a newspaper article written in 1974 by the Telegraph Journal in St. John within the province of New Brunswick on the 15th of January 1974. The article goes on to explain that a fire happened in a workshop at a paper mill in the town of Dalhousie. The article mentions a 1972 model B-train haulage truck with double trailer. Remember that these paper and pulp mills would have received logging trucks. Another newspaper article I found dated a few years later in October 1977 by the Time Transcript was an article also regarding the paper and pulp mill in Dalhousie again, which also mentioned a B train, which was a sort of piggyback arrangement. This was a bit confusing to me. The second article, referring to the exact same paper mill in the town of Dalhousie, is evidence to support that the 1974 article mentioning a B train was a legit term used at the time and not just a one-off anomaly for 1974. You see, the B trains they refer to were two logging trailers that were a rear logging trailer that would actually pull up via a winch and sit on top of the lead trailer when not carrying any logs or timbers. I found some old videos of this, I believe, but they don't really look like B doubles, so I don't know if we can they can be deemed as B doubles as per today's terminology. I had read some comments from some older Canadian people that said that B trains to them back in the day were logging trailers where the rear trailer would pull up and piggyback on top of the lead trailer. These videos are possibly what they're talking about. I don't really know. It doesn't seem to fit the definition of what a B train is today. So if you know anything more, please let me know. 1975. The second oldest mention of a B train phrase I could find was from a publication from 1975 called Trucks and Trailers and Their Application to Logging Operations, a Reference Manual, which was issued by J.A. McNally from the University of New Brunswick Department of Forest Engineering in Canada. Unfortunately, I was only able to view small snippets available to me in Google Books, and a copy of this book is not available locally to me. However, this was in 1975 and used the name B-train when referring to the trailer setups used in the logging industry. When I tried to find old pictures of B-double logging trailers, sometimes called pulpwood trailers, in Canada, I found nothing but old pictures that had no context or information or dates. The photos certainly make them look old at least. Here are some pictures now. If you know anything more, please let me know. These ones here are part of the late Franklin Gordon collection, who lived in Canada. Here are some B-doubles carrying pulpwood with a caption calling them B-trains. Franklin's captions related to these photos mention Camp 75 Red Rock, which I always assumed was near Thunder Bay, Ontario, and that they were being pulled by white freight liners. But unfortunately, there was no date. 1976. Next, in 1976, we see the emergence of the first liquid tanker B-double in Canada, operated by Economy Carriers Limited, or ECL, from Calgary, Alberta. ECL were the first in Canada to use a B-double tanker. The B-double was made as a joint effort between ECL and the trailer manufacturer West Tank Industries, later called West Tank Willock. Here is a picture of Doug Key later in life, who was an engineer with West Tank Willock back in the 1970s and assisted me with some information via email. During this time, an honourable mention goes to the trailer manufacturer Hutchinson Industries from Toronto, who also pioneered the manufacture in the early days of the B-double tankers in Canada shortly after West Tank Willock. From the late 1970s and onwards, B-doubles started appearing in large numbers within Canada, particularly in the western provinces and for more than just logging and liquid tankers. This concludes the Canadian part of the video. Late 1970s. Late 1970s, and we now move over to New Zealand. The earliest examples appear to have been platforms and grain bulkers, these emerging sometime in the late 1970s. Among the earliest examples were two outfits operated by Catway Haulage of Auckland on a soft drinks contract, headed up by an impressive 6x4 Kenworth Aerodyne tractors. They were configured with two trailers of similar length, each riding on tandem axles. A similar combination was used by the Ikea Timber Company to haul lengths of sawn timber behind a rugged Mack superliner, while a splendid green-livered Kenworth K124 sleeper operated by F.J. Ramsey was used to carry wooden fencing posts. This information I just mentioned was from one of Martin Phippard's articles. I was only able to find more information and photos about F.J. Ramsey's B-double, who is said to be the first on-road B-double used in New Zealand. F.J. Ramsey, later renamed to Ramsey Roundwood, was a transport company that operated out of Rotorua on the North Island. John and Bernice owned and operated the business and travelled to Canada in the late 1970s to investigate feather bunches and general forestry operations in Canada. Whilst there, John spotted a B-train and thought it was a great idea. After returning to New Zealand with the idea in his mind, John contacted Neil Peterkin of Roadrunner a trailer manufacturer, to manufacture a B-train trailer for their business. The B-train was to carry timber poles and posts. This B-train began operating on the road in 1978. New Zealand kept the Canadian name B-train. This concludes this New Zealand section. 1979, and we enter the Australian scene. Before we go too far, none of this information on the introduction of the B-double into Australia would have been available to me if not for Bob Pearson, who is said to be the father of the Australian B-double. Bob wrote a book in 2009 called B-doubles: The First Decade in Australia, A Personal Perspective, which I highly recommend. The story for Australia begins with a letter in 1979 from the Shell Petroleum Company of Australia, addressed to the Minister for Transport in the state of Victoria. The letter requests a permit to use Canadian-style B-trains on selected routes in Victoria. The ministry referred the letter on to the Country Roads Board for consideration and response to them. Bob Pearson, who worked for them at the time, and so the letter ended up on his desk. Long story short, and after much deliberation with other parties including the National Association of State Road Authorities, called NASRA, Bob was chosen to visit Canada to investigate and study their B-doubles and determine if they would be viable for the Australian roads. Keep in mind, at this time Australia already had road trains, but these were only contained within certain parts of Australia, i.e. the flat areas in the outback. A trip was approved by NASRA and in 1981, Bob Pearson travelled to Canada to study and investigate Canadian B-trains. Upon Bob's return, he had determined that they were a viable option and suggested trials should be undertaken in selected locations in Australia. 1982. In 1982, NASRA agreed to support trial operations of B-doubles, with the Commissioner of Main Roads in Western Australia offering to host the trials. The Main Roads Department of Western Australia issued permits to two companies, Wills Transtore and Temples Transport, for a trial lasting 3 months. Each company were to trial one B-double. Apparently it was a bit of a race to see who could get on the road first, and in December 1982, Wills Transtore thus became the first legal B-double in Australia. Here is a picture of their B-double. Apparently the driver for Wills Transtore was named Gary, but I don't have a last name or any further information. Both B-doubles for Wills Transtore and Temples Transport were manufactured by Howard Porter, a trailer manufacturer in Perth, Western Australia, that still exists today. 1983. Not long, in early 1983, Temples Transport then began operating their B-double, driven by Bob Charlton, and were therefore the second legal B-double in Australia. Some excellent photos are shown here of their B-double and also a photo of Bob. 1984. Things went well in the trial and the B-doubles started moving east across Australia, with the states of South Australia and Victoria using theirs for the first time during this year. In February 1984, approval was given to the Murray-Goulburn Cooperative to use B-doubles subject to selective roads only, and therefore became the first B-doubles in Victoria. The first B-double in South Australia was by Fleet Express for overnight operations between Adelaide and Port Lincoln. 1985. The first use in Queensland was by Lawyer Julius as a trial in early 1985, carrying molasses between Bundaberg and Maryborough. Perry Noyes was the general manager at the time. The rest becomes history, and B-doubles are now all over Australia. The introduction was not exactly a smooth one, as it did meet some pushback, particularly from the public who didn't want road trains driving through their village. Bob Pearson book goes into more detail on the story than I have in this video, so I highly recommend the read. Now to the name B-double and why it changed in Australia shortly after its introduction. When first introduced into Australia in 1982, Australia used the Canadian name B-Train for the first couple of years up until 1985. Canada did not have Australian road trains, and they felt that it was necessary and important to differentiate these from the much larger road trains that we already had. Particularly in the public's eyes, when they heard a B train might be going through their sleepy little town, they thought of big road trains, and they felt it was important for the public not to associate them with road trains. The name B-double came about after deliberation of a committee of 4 who met one afternoon in Bob Pearson's office in Kew, Victoria in early 1985. The B still represents the coupling type, i.e. the turntable or fifth wheel, and the double represents the number of trailers, 2. Since then, Australia then expanded on this terminology to define all the different types of combination trailers used in Australia. This brought about the A-double, which is the same as Canada's A-train, and because we have large road trains in Australia with more trailers, they are now designated by examples such as B-triple, BAB quad, and many more, but we won't cover this in this video. This concludes the Australian section of the video, and we come near the end of the video. If you are from Canada, I need your help, as I was not able to find too much information about the first B trains used in Canada, particularly for the pulpwood industry. If anyone is able to visit your library and flick through old forestry and paper and pulp magazines from the early 1970s, you may be able to help me fill in some gaps. I only had access to some of Canada's magazines during this time in that industry in Sydney, but not all the magazines we had here.